Vincent Brothers had always seemed like an ordinary man, a husband, father, and vice principal at John C. Fremont Elementary School in Bakersfield, California. To those around him, he was just another face in the crowd, a hardworking individual dedicated to his job, his family, and his community. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, Vincent's dissatisfaction was slowly growing, like a storm gathering force. He loved his wife, Joni Harper, but the pressure of their relationship weighed heavily on him. She was a caring mother to their three children: Mark, aged 4, Marshall, only 6 weeks old, and Lindsay, a bubbly 2-year-old girl. Yet no matter how much love she gave him, Vincent felt smothered, trapped in a life he didn't feel equipped to handle. Their home, once a place of warmth, now felt suffocating. Joni, often busy with the kids, couldn't see the growing storm in Vincent's mind. She had her own struggles, trying to balance being a mother and a wife while caring for her aging mother, Ernestine Harper, who lived with them. Ernestine, despite her age, was fiercely protective of her daughter and grandchildren. But her presence, too, had become a source of stress for Vincent. The house, once filled with laughter, had turned into a battleground of unspoken frustrations. Vincent didn't talk to anyone about his growing unease. He didn't voice his discontent to his colleagues at school or to his friends. Instead, he started retreating into himself, spending more time alone, brooding over his frustrations. It wasn't that he hated his family, it was just that he couldn't bear the weight of responsibility anymore. The constant demands from his children, the pressure of being a provider, and the expectations of being a good husband all felt unbearable. One evening, after a long day of work, Vincent sat alone in the dim light of their living room, staring at the family photo on the wall. It was a picture of a happy family, Joni smiling, holding the kids, Ernestine standing proudly beside them. Vincent felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Why did everything feel so heavy, he thought to himself. Why couldn't he just have some peace? Joni entered the room, her tired eyes meeting his. She smiled gently, asking if he was okay, but Vincent didn't respond. He simply nodded, forcing a smile, knowing that his wife didn't see the storm brewing inside him. He was too good at pretending everything was fine, too good at hiding his thoughts from her. But the truth was, Vincent was far from okay. He didn't know when it had started, but somewhere along the way the idea had taken root in his mind. What if he could just escape? What if he could rid himself of everything that was tying him down? A life without responsibility, without the endless demands of family and work. He could feel his pulse quicken as the thought solidified. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the kitchen knife resting on the counter. For a split second, his mind wandered into dark territory, but he quickly pushed the thought away. I'm not that kind of person, he reassured himself. Yet the idea lingered. Later that night, as Vincent lay in bed next to Joni, he stared at the ceiling, wide awake. His wife's steady breathing beside him only deepened his sense of isolation. He felt suffocated by the life he had created, the one he felt unable to escape from. Could he do it? Could he actually walk away from all of this? His thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound. Ernestine moving around in the kitchen, perhaps making tea or preparing for bed. Vincent stared at the ceiling, conflicted. He had to do something, anything to get out of this life. The thought didn't frighten him as it once would have. Instead, it felt like a strange sense of clarity, a promise of release. For the first time in months, Vincent felt a rush of anticipation. He wasn't sure what he would do next, but he knew one thing: the storm inside him was about to break. Vincent Brothers had always been good at keeping up appearances. At work, he was well respected, a model vice principal in the eyes of his colleagues and students. At home, he was a loving husband, the father of 3 beautiful children. But the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. The pressure, the constant demands, the expectations, all of it weighed on him like an anchor, pulling him deeper into a sea of resentment and bitterness. His wife, Joni, had no idea. She was busy with the children and the house, her focus always on them, always trying to make things work. Vincent watched her from across the dinner table, her eyes sparkling as she smiled at him. But it didn't feel real to him anymore. He had spent so many years playing the role of the good husband, the good father, but it no longer satisfied him. Every smile, every word of praise from his colleagues, every moment of affection from Joni felt like a reminder of his growing frustration. One evening, after a long day, Vincent stood in front of the mirror in their bathroom, looking at himself. He barely recognized the man staring back, the tired eyes, the furrowed brow. He wasn't the man he used to be. The pressure of providing for his family, of being the steady rock that they all leaned on, had worn him down. And the worst part? No one even noticed. He felt invisible, as though his existence was only defined by the roles he played: husband, father, teacher. But where was he? Where was Vincent? The thought lingered, gnawing at him. He had always been taught that family was everything, that love was unconditional. Yet as he stared at his reflection, it became clearer than ever. His love for his family had become a burden, and he was drowning beneath it. What if I could just leave all of this behind? The thought floated into his mind, unbidden but powerful. It was a fleeting thought, a crazy idea, but it stuck, and it kept coming back every night as he lay in bed beside Joni, as he tried to sleep, restless and uneasy. What if he didn't have to be the good husband anymore? What if he didn't have to keep pretending? The next day, he found himself researching. At first, it was innocent enough. He looked up vacation spots, places he could escape to for a few days, a weekend to clear his head. But then, his searches took a darker turn. How to disappear without a trace, how to fake an alibi. Each search led him deeper down a path he hadn't anticipated, and the more he read, the more the idea took root. He could do it. He could start over. He could leave all of this behind. That evening, when Joni asked him about his plans for the weekend, he simply smiled. "Just need some time alone," he said. She didn't question it. Joni never questioned him. She was too busy with the kids, with everything else, to see the cracks forming around him. Vincent smiled at her, but inside, something twisted. It wasn't just about needing a break anymore, it was about escaping. And so the plans began. Little by little, they came together. He started buying things: life insurance policies, equipment, and all the materials he would need to pull it off. He wasn't just preparing for a break. He was preparing for a new life. A life where he wasn't tied down, where he didn't have to pretend anymore. But as Vincent moved deeper into his plan, the weight of it all began to feel heavier. He didn't feel excited. He felt numb. It was as if something inside of him had clicked, and now there was no turning back. And so the brewing storm continued. The more Vincent thought about it, the more inevitable it seemed. His family had no idea what was coming. Joni, Ernestine, and the children. None of them could see the storm in his eyes. But it was coming, and nothing would stop it. The house was eerily quiet that night. Vincent had spent the day preparing, making sure everything was in place. As he stood in the dimly lit hallway, his mind was racing. He had planned every detail, every step, yet despite the meticulousness of his preparations, something gnawed at him, an unsettling feeling that had nothing to do with the logistics. It was the darkness, the growing storm inside him, now ready to burst. Joni had put the children to bed earlier than usual, a tired smile on her face as she kissed them goodnight. Ernestine, her mother, was in the kitchen preparing her nightly cup of tea, humming softly to herself. All was normal, or so it seemed. Vincent sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. The flickering screen did little to distract him. His fingers tapped nervously on the armrest as his thoughts spiraled. Was this the right thing to do? For a brief moment, doubt crept in. He remembered the faces of his children, their laughter, their innocence. Lindsay's giggle, Marcus's excited chatter, and little Marshall, barely old enough to understand the world around him. But then the thoughts turned, as they always did. Why should I carry this burden? Why should I keep pretending that I'm happy? The thought wasn't new. He had been consumed by it for months now. His discontent, his suffocation, the demands of being the perfect husband, the perfect father, the perfect man. But that man wasn't him. That man was a mask. And tonight Vincent had decided to remove it. As he stood up, his movements felt mechanical, deliberate. The coldness in his chest was overwhelming now, drowning out any remnants of warmth or love he might have once had for his family. He knew this was the moment when everything would change. He stepped into the kitchen where Ernestine was sipping her tea, the quiet murmur of the kitchen lights buzzing in the background. The warmth of the room, the smell of tea, it felt surreal, like a dream. Vincent stood there for a moment, staring at his mother-in-law, her back turned, unaware of what was about to happen. Her voice broke the silence, soft and steady. "Vincent, you okay? You look distant tonight." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched her, taking in the lines of her face, the way her hands trembled slightly as she set her cup down. He wondered briefly if she knew, if she could sense that something was wrong, but her face was calm, peaceful even. So much peace, he thought bitterly. Finally he spoke, his voice strained but controlled. "I'm fine, Ernestine, just tired." Her eyes softened, a mother's concern for her son-in-law, but she didn't question him further. She picked up the tea again, humming softly under her breath, seemingly content. Vincent couldn't look at her anymore. He turned and made his way to the staircase. His pulse was pounding now, his body a mix of fear and exhilaration. He reached the top of the stairs and paused outside the children's rooms. He could hear them breathing, hear the soft, rhythmic sound of their innocent slumber. Why am I doing this? The question flickered in his mind, but it was quickly drowned out by the need to act, to end it all. The weight of his thoughts pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket, making it impossible to think clearly. All he could focus on was the act itself, the plan, the end. With a deep breath, Vincent entered Joni's room. She was already asleep, her body nestled under the covers, her back to him. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at her. This is it, he thought. He felt no joy, no relief, only a hollow emptiness. He reached for the drawer where they kept their family's belongings, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He hesitated for a second, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on him. But then the storm inside him roared louder than his conscience, and he couldn't stop himself. The events that followed happened too fast. There was no turning back now. Joni didn't wake up until it was too late, her sleepy eyes blinking in confusion as the reality of what was happening began to settle in. But even then, Vincent was calm, detached. He had crossed the line, and in his mind it was too late to stop. The house, once full of love and laughter, fell silent. The storm that had been brewing inside Vincent was now fully unleashed. The calm before the storm had shattered. Now there was nothing but darkness. As the silence enveloped the house, Vincent felt an overwhelming sense of nothing. No relief, no satisfaction. Just an endless, suffocating silence. The hum of the airplane engine was the only sound in Vincent's ears as he stared out of the window. The bright lights of Bakersfield had already faded behind him, swallowed by the night. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the strange exhilaration that coursed through him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of control. The plan was unfolding just as he had envisioned it. Vincent had left his home in chaos. The silence left behind by the murders was now a heavy weight on his shoulders, but he couldn't afford to think about it. He had a job to do, and he had to keep moving. His alibi had to be perfect. The plane ride to Columbus, Ohio was just the beginning. The rest of the plan was already set in motion. He had taken meticulous steps to cover his tracks. First, the tickets for his flight. A quick check of his phone records would show that he was hundreds of miles away when the murders occurred. The flight itself, booked at the last minute, was enough to convince anyone who questioned his whereabouts. But it wasn't just about being somewhere else. It was about the story he would tell, about the careful creation of a timeline that no one could dispute. He arrived in Ohio late at night, the city lights sprawling beneath him like a map of his escape route. Renting the car had been the next step. Easy, efficient. He was just another man passing through, the kind of traveler who would blend in without anyone noticing. That was the key, staying unnoticed. He drove through the quiet streets of Ohio, the cool air drifting in through the cracked window. His mind, however, was far from calm. He kept replaying the moment in his head, the moment when he'd taken the life of his family. Joni's final look, the children's faces, frozen in shock, all of it was now buried in the recesses of his mind, tucked away behind the layers of his alibi. This is the last time I'll ever think of them, he thought, though the words rang hollow in his mind. By morning, Vincent was halfway through his drive back to Bakersfield, where his next steps were already clear. He'd make a quick stop in a remote area, drop the car off, and head back to the airport. By the time anyone realized what had happened, he would be long gone, miles away from the scene of the crime. His timing was flawless. It had to be. As he continued his journey, the radio played softly in the background, offering a distraction from the whirlwind inside his head. It wasn't the relief he expected, though. Every passing mile only brought him closer to the inevitable confrontation with reality. He knew that once he returned to Bakersfield, there would be questions, but he had prepared for that. The perfect alibi was not just about being in the right place at the right time. It was about the certainty that no one would doubt him. The sun began to set as he drove. casting long shadows across the highway. His mind raced with the details, making sure everything lined up. He had to make sure the car's mileage would match the trip, that there was no trace of him in Ohio that could connect him to the crime. The forensic evidence would have to be spotless. And then, there was the small matter of the cigarette butt he had dropped on the ground at the gas station. He had carefully collected it after tossing it to the ground, knowing it could be a potential lead. In the back of his mind, a nagging voice tried to break through, the voice of guilt, of doubt. But Vincent shut it out. This is the only way. He thought of the life that awaited him, the freedom he would have, the fresh start. All it would take was one more step, one more lie, and he would be free. By the time he reached Bakersfield, the weight of the night was starting to settle in. He parked the car at the edge of the town, just as he had planned, and made his way to the airport. His heart pounded as he boarded the plane back to Ohio. The hardest part was over. There was no turning back now. The plane's wheels lifted off the runway, and Vincent settled back into his seat, feeling the strange sensation of release. He had done it. He was free, or so he thought. Detective Monroe had seen his fair share of crime scenes over the years, but there was something about this case that gnawed at him. From the moment the call came in, something didn't sit right. The brutal execution of a family, his gut told him there was more beneath the surface than just a random act of violence. This wasn't the work of a simple burglar or an estranged lover. There was method, precision in the brutality. He had stood in the middle of the crime scene, studying every detail, while the uniformed officers processed the evidence around him. The house was disturbingly normal, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest a violent struggle, yet the bloodshed had been horrific. Joni Harper, her 3 children, and her mother had all been killed in their own home, leaving behind an eerie emptiness. Monroe had seen the horror in the eyes of the officers as they moved from room to room. But his mind was already focused elsewhere, on the one person who had the most to gain from their deaths, Vincent Brothers, Joni's husband, the father of her children. He hadn't even needed to meet him to feel the suspicion settling in. A man who appeared perfect on the outside, yet Vincent's cold detachment in photos sent a signal to Monroe that couldn't be ignored. The first few hours of the investigation were filled with the usual, interviews with neighbors, friends, and family members. The initial reports painted a picture of a happy family, no known enemies, no signs of distress. But Vincent's odd behavior at work, his distant attitude toward his wife and children, didn't go unnoticed by those who had worked closely with him. Monroe pulled up Vincent's file, scanning it quickly. He was a well-regarded vice principal at John C. Fremont Elementary School, but there was little else to suggest his life was as perfect as it appeared. The deeper Monroe dug, the more inconsistencies he found. Vincent had been seen by colleagues as increasingly irritable and distant over the past few months. A few close friends mentioned his vague conversations about wanting change, but nothing concrete. Yet there was one key piece of evidence that Monroe found too interesting to ignore. Vincent's recent purchase of a life insurance policy for his family, just weeks before the murders. Not only had he taken out a policy on Joni, but the children were also listed as beneficiaries. A man who had no prior financial concerns, a man whose family was seemingly well off, suddenly insuring them all. Monroe couldn't help but question the timing. He sat in his office that night reviewing the reports, when a call came in from one of the forensic specialists. The bug traces found in the car rented by Vincent. They're not from around here. We found a species common to the Western Rockies. Monroe leaned forward in his chair, a flicker of realization crossing his mind. Vincent had rented a car, driven it to Bakersfield, then returned it to Ohio. The forensic team had uncovered a crucial detail, the presence of insects that could only be found in areas west of the Rockies. Monroe's instincts told him something was off about Vincent's alibi. The mileage on the car and the timing just didn't add up. It was the first crack in Vincent's perfect story. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The inconsistencies in Vincent's story, the strange behavior, the insurance policies, the unexplained trip, all pointed to him. Monroe wasn't ready to make an arrest just yet, but everything about this case was leaning in one direction: Vincent Brothers. As Monroe walked through the house again, his mind raced. He stood in the children's room, looking at the small, empty beds. The stillness of it hit him harder than he expected. He had seen families torn apart before, but there was something especially painful about the innocence lost in this case. This wasn't just a murder to Vincent. It was a means of escape, a way to rid himself of everything he couldn't handle. But that wasn't the way Monroe saw it. For him, it was cold and calculated. And as he continued to piece together the evidence, the weight of the truth became heavier. Back at his desk, Monroe tapped his fingers on the table, thinking about the way Vincent's life seemed to be unraveling beneath the surface. There was no denying it now. Vincent had killed his family, and it was only a matter of time before he was caught. But Monroe knew something else. Vincent wasn't just going to give up that easily. He was calculating. He was going to fight, and that would make bringing him to justice that much harder. Monroe exhaled deeply, his mind already moving ahead to the next steps. The investigation was far from over, but he could feel the walls closing in on Vincent. The perfect alibi was about to crumble, and when it did, the truth would come crashing down hard and fast. The investigation had been progressing steadily, but something about this case felt off to Detective Monroe. The more he pieced together, the more it seemed that Vincent Brothers was too good at hiding his tracks. However, even the most perfect plans often had cracks, and it was only a matter of time before those cracks revealed the truth. Monroe's instincts told him to dig deeper, to stop looking at the surface, and start analyzing the finer details. His eyes scanned the latest forensic reports, and one piece of evidence stood out, a detail he had overlooked at first: the car Vincent had rented. It seemed like just another part of the plan, another piece of Vincent's elaborate alibi. But upon closer inspection, something didn't add up. The car, a rental from Ohio, had been returned with mysterious residue inside. At first, it seemed like just another mundane detail. However, Monroe's sharp eye caught something that sent a chill down his spine. Insect traces, specifically a type found in the Western Rockies, far from where Vincent had claimed to have been. The forensic team had run tests on the insects and confirmed their origins. Monroe sat back in his chair, rereading the report again. Why would Vincent travel that far? He had told everyone he went to Ohio, only to come back and create an airtight alibi. But now, the evidence suggested he had traveled further. This was no coincidence. Monroe could feel the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. He knew the timeline didn't match. Vincent's flight, which should have brought him back to Bakersfield at a specific time, had been followed by an unexplained gap, just long enough for him to have made a detour. The mileage on the car was also inconsistent. The breakthrough. Monroe pulled up Vincent's rental contract and looked at the car's odometer. The numbers didn't align with the trip Vincent had described. The route he had taken didn't add up to the amount of miles on the car. Something was wrong. There was no way Vincent had gone straight to Ohio and back. In the meantime, the forensic team had also discovered another shocking detail: a cigarette butt at a gas station, discarded along Vincent's supposed route. The odd thing? It didn't belong to Vincent. No, it belonged to someone else. A second person had been with Vincent during his drive. Monroe ran his fingers across the map, tracing the route Vincent had taken. Who else was with him? Monroe knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just an open and shut case. There was someone else involved, and that someone had been with Vincent all along. He couldn't escape the feeling that Vincent had been meticulous in covering his tracks. But this mistake, this overlooked detail, was the key to everything. The phone call came through just as Monroe was going over the reports again. Detective Davis, a colleague from the forensics team, was on the line. "Monroe, you need to see this," Davis said. "We've found something else." The next few hours were a whirlwind of new developments. Vincent's personal phone record showed something Monroe had missed: a call to Ernestine Harper just days before the murders. The timing was wrong. Vincent's call didn't match the events leading up to the crime. As Monroe listened to the details, he pieced them together in his mind. The call was a red flag, a signal that Vincent might have been preparing for something long before that fateful night. The life insurance policies were one thing, but this was something far darker. Monroe had suspected that Vincent wasn't just frustrated with his family life. He was calculating, planning. As Monroe continued to dig through the evidence, he saw the same thing over and over. Vincent had set up a perfect crime, a perfect alibi. But now the threads were unraveling, a trail of lies. Each layer he uncovered led to another, and it was starting to feel like Vincent had known exactly what he was doing all along. Every mistake, every inconsistency told a story of a man so desperate for freedom that he was willing to destroy everything in his path. Monroe stood up from his desk, a sense of resolve settling over him. He knew what had to be done. The evidence was clear now. Vincent was guilty, but the real question was whether he would ever truly admit it. As the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that this case was more than just a murder investigation. It was the unraveling of a carefully crafted lie. But with the evidence piling up, one thing was certain. Vincent's perfect alibi was no longer so perfect. Detective Monroe could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. Every day that passed, the walls were closing in on Vincent Brothers. The evidence was becoming undeniable. The bug traces, the mileage discrepancies, the cigarette butt, each new detail was a link in the chain tightening around Vincent. Monroe knew he had the right man, but the question was how long it would take to make him crack. Monroe sat in his office late one night, poring over the evidence once more. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. Despite all the physical evidence pointing toward Vincent's guilt, something about the way Vincent had covered his tracks made Monroe uneasy. It was almost as if Vincent expected to get away with it. The phone rang, snapping Monroe out of his thoughts. It was Detective Davis from the forensics team. "Monroe, you might want to hear this," Davis said, his voice tinged with urgency. Monroe listened as Davis recounted the latest findings. The forensic team had gone over the family's financial records, and one of the strangest things had surfaced. Vincent had been planning his escape for months. The life insurance policies were just the tip of the iceberg. Vincent had sold off assets under his name, including his car, some jewelry, and even household electronics. Small things that wouldn't immediately be noticed, but enough to give him the cash he needed to disappear. A chill ran down Monroe's spine. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was calculated. Vincent had been planning his escape for months, perhaps even longer, and the murders were just the final, tragic step in his elaborate plan. Monroe hung up the phone, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. He knew that Vincent had the means and the motive, but there was still one thing that didn't add up. How had Vincent managed to maintain his composure, especially after the murders? People who commit acts like this usually crack under pressure, but Vincent had been cool, calm, and collected. He had a plan, and that plan had been almost flawless. As Monroe continued to ponder, he heard a knock on his door. It was Detective Allen, the officer assigned to watch Vincent's movements. "We've got something," Allen said, holding up a small stack of papers. "Vincent's been more active than we thought." Monroe looked up, intrigued. "Go on." Allen sat down, flipping through the pages. "We've been tracking his movements, and it turns out Vincent made a couple of stops after he returned the rental car. Places that weren't on his alibi. Places he had no business being. And get this, he was at a convenience store just hours before he flew back to Ohio. The camera footage shows him buying something, but the clerk couldn't remember what it was. However, the timestamp from the security camera matches the moment the murder was believed to have occurred." Monroe leaned forward, his mind spinning. The pieces were finally coming together. This wasn't just a random act of violence. Vincent had made sure to leave no stone unturned, every detail accounted for, right down to the last second of his alibi. "You're telling me he was that meticulous?" Monroe asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. "Exactly," Allen replied. "But there's more. We found a secondary phone line, one he's been using to make calls to a burner phone. We don't know who he's been talking to, but it's clear now that someone else has been helping him." Monroe's stomach churned. "Who?" "We're working on it, but if we're right, this isn't just Vincent's mess anymore. Someone else is in on it." The realization hit Monroe like a punch to the gut. There was a second player in this game, someone who had been orchestrating events alongside Vincent. It was a chilling thought, but Monroe couldn't dwell on that now. They were so close, but still so far. He gathered the case files and looked over them once more, the weight of the truth settling in. There was no doubt in his mind now. Vincent had killed his family, and there was someone out there, someone who had been aiding him every step of the way. The investigation was far from over, but Monroe's resolve had hardened. He would find the answers. He would bring justice to the victims, even if it meant facing Vincent's twisted mind head-on. As Monroe prepared to head out to meet with his team, the full extent of what he was up against began to sink in. The tightening noose around Vincent was undeniable, but Monroe knew that the real challenge was still ahead. The final pieces of the puzzle were yet to be put into place. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to click, and Detective Monroe could feel the intensity of the investigation intensifying with every new detail that emerged. Vincent's perfect alibi was beginning to crumble under the weight of the evidence, and what had initially seemed like a straightforward case of family annihilation now revealed itself to be something much more calculated and cold-blooded. Monroe sat at his desk, the weight of the case heavy on his shoulders. It had taken days of digging, hours of questioning, and a meticulous review of evidence. But there it was, the final break in the case. The phone records from Vincent Brothers' burner phone had revealed something startling. Vincent had not been alone during his journey from Ohio to Bakersfield. Monroe stared at the printed page, the phone numbers Vincent had dialed illuminating a sinister truth. There were multiple calls placed to a number registered under an alias, a name that didn't match anyone in the family's immediate circle. The name was unfamiliar, but Monroe's instinct screamed that this person was more than just a casual acquaintance. Someone had helped Vincent orchestrate the murders, someone who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. The thought of a second accomplice had been in the back of Monroe's mind for days, but now the evidence made it undeniable. The phone records painted a picture of Vincent communicating regularly with this mysterious figure before and after the murders, someone who knew too much about the family, about Vincent's stress, and about his deepest frustrations. Monroe's heart raced as he looked at the numbers. This person had been inside Vincent's world, manipulating his actions, offering support, and perhaps even encouraging his darkest impulses. Monroe reached for the phone. He needed to speak with his team. He needed to find out who this person was, and more importantly, what role they had played in the killings. He dialed Detective Allen, his most trusted investigator. "Allen," Monroe said, urgency in his voice, "I need you to pull every file on this number. I want to know who it belongs to, what they're connected to, and any possible ties to Vincent. No more delays." "I'm on it," Allen replied quickly. The tension in the room was palpable. Monroe knew they were on the brink of uncovering something even darker than he had anticipated. As the minutes ticked by, Monroe's mind raced through all the possible scenarios. Who could have been involved in helping Vincent? Someone with a close understanding of his life? Someone who might have shared his frustrations? Monroe's mind kept returning to the fact that Vincent had been so cold and calculated. This couldn't have been a spur-of-the-moment act. This was planned. And Vincent had the help of someone with knowledge of the family's inner workings. Hours passed, and Monroe's patience was wearing thin. Finally, Allen called back. "Monroe, you need to see this," Allen said. "I've traced the number. It belongs to a former colleague of Vincent's, someone he worked with at the school, Mark Grayson. He's a teacher at the same elementary school, and it looks like he's been in touch with Vincent for months, maybe even longer." Monroe felt the blood drain from his face. Mark Grayson? The man had been in close contact with Vincent at work, and now it appeared he was more than just a colleague. Monroe's gut told him that Grayson had been the one fueling Vincent's growing frustrations, offering advice, and perhaps even pushing him toward the deadly plan. "This is it," Monroe muttered. "We've got him. Grayson is the key. Get me everything on him. His whereabouts, his relationship with Vincent, everything." The sense of urgency was now more intense than ever. They had already tracked down Grayson's address and planned to bring him in for questioning. Monroe knew that with Grayson's help, they could finally close the case and bring justice to Joni, Ernestine, and the children. As Monroe left his office to join his team, the realization hit him. Vincent's perfect alibi had unraveled completely, and with Grayson's involvement, the final piece of the puzzle was now in place. The man who had been orchestrating everything from behind the scenes was about to face the consequences of his actions. But as Monroe stepped out into the night, the final question lingered in his mind. How far would Grayson go to protect Vincent? The interrogation room was sterile and cold, but inside it, the temperature felt as if it had risen 10 degrees. Vincent Brothers sat across from Detective Monroe, his posture stiff and controlled, though his eyes flickered with signs of unease. He had maintained his calm for days, even under the scrutiny of the investigation. But now, as the walls seemed to close in on him, it was evident that Vincent's perfect alibi was falling apart. Monroe studied him, his gaze steady. "You've been careful, Vincent, very careful, but you're running out of time." The words hung in the air, thick with the implication of what was coming next. The detective's tone wasn't accusatory, it was calm, almost patient. But it was clear that Monroe knew something Vincent didn't yet realize. The game was up. Vincent's lips twitched, his gaze shifting to the table between them, then back up at Monroe. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice steady, though there was a slight tremor in the edge of his words. Monroe leaned forward slightly, his tone unwavering. You know exactly what I mean. The insurance policies, the calls to Ernestine just days before the murders, the car rental, but most of all, the bugs in the car. You didn't just take a trip to Ohio, did you? He paused, watching as the realization flickered across Vincent's face. You took a detour, didn't you? Vincent's jaw clenched. He shifted in his seat, trying to mask the tension that was beginning to seep into his composure. How much does he know? Monroe watched him carefully. He wasn't asking questions anymore. He was making statements, forcing Vincent to acknowledge them. You were in Bakersfield, and you knew exactly what you were doing. The distance, the timing, it all adds up, Vincent. But here's the kicker. We found traces of a second person. And when we traced the calls you made, it wasn't just you alone planning this. Someone else was with you. A bead of sweat formed on Vincent's forehead, despite the cool air of the room. Monroe could see his facade cracking, the cold calm slipping into something darker. His hands, which had been folded neatly in front of him, were now twitching ever so slightly. His control was slipping. Vincent took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. You're trying to pin this on me. There's nothing you can prove. Monroe's voice was calm, but the words hit hard. We already have. Your alibi is a lie. The forensic team found traces of insects that are only native to the Western Rockies. You were nowhere near Ohio. You made sure to cover your tracks, but there's always something you miss. Always. Vincent's expression shifted, and for the first time, Monroe saw a flash of fear that Vincent had been trying so desperately to hide. But Vincent wasn't ready to give in yet. His eyes darted toward the door, his mind working to find an escape, a way out. But he knew deep down that it was too late. There was nowhere left to run. You think I'm just going to confess? Vincent's voice was cold, though there was an underlying tremor now. What do you think I'll say? That I killed them? That I'm guilty? You're wrong. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Monroe leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Vincent's. You're right, Vincent. We don't know the full story, but we're getting there. You planned this for months. You didn't just snap. You calculated every move, every lie. There was a long silence in the room. Vincent's breathing had become heavier, but he still wouldn't break. Monroe knew he was close. The psychological games had begun. You don't have to say anything. The evidence speaks for itself. Your actions spoke for you the moment you made the decision to kill your family. His voice was firm but steady, like a seasoned professional guiding Vincent toward the truth. Vincent's gaze flickered, something flickering behind his eyes. Was it regret, or was it just desperation? Monroe wasn't sure. The longer he sat there, the more it felt like Vincent was teetering on the edge, fighting with himself, trying to come to terms with the enormity of what he had done. After what seemed like an eternity, Vincent spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Wasn't supposed to be like this, he muttered. I just wanted out. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. Monroe's instincts screamed that this was it. The truth was coming out piece by piece. But Vincent wasn't ready to surrender just yet. He had convinced himself that what he did was justified, that the plan was his only way out. You can tell yourself that all you want, Vincent, Monroe said softly, his eyes unwavering. But the truth is, you killed your family. You killed them because you were too weak to face your responsibilities, and now you'll pay for it. Vincent's eyes welled with tears. Whether from remorse or something else, Monroe couldn't tell. But he was no longer the confident, controlled man who had walked into that room. Now Vincent was just a man caught in his own lies, staring down the consequences of his choices. Monroe stood, his gaze fixed on Vincent. This is over. You're not walking away from this one. As Monroe left the room, he could hear the faint sound of Vincent's muffled sobs. But he knew it was too late for redemption. The truth had been unearthed, and there was no escaping the inevitable. The courtroom was tense, filled with a mix of solemnity and anticipation. It was standing room only as people filed in to witness the trial of Vincent Brothers, the man who had shattered a family and left a community grappling with disbelief. His cold, calculating actions had torn apart the lives of his wife, his children, and his mother-in-law, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. Detective Monroe sat at the back of the room, his arms crossed, watching as the proceedings began. He had been the one to uncover the truth, to bring the evidence to light, but now it was out of his hands. The jury would decide whether Vincent would face justice for the heinous crimes he had committed. Vincent sat at the defendant's table, his expression one of practiced indifference. His eyes didn't meet the gaze of the victims' families, who were seated across from him. Instead, he stared straight ahead, his face set in a mask of cold determination. He looked the part of a man who had been wrongly accused, though deep down, even he knew the truth. The prosecutor stood up, ready to make their case. The opening statements were delivered with clarity and conviction. The prosecutor outlined the brutal details of the crime, the methodical planning, the chilling lack of remorse, and the cold-blooded execution of Vincent's family. Every word felt like a hammer hitting the nail on the head, each statement laying bare the brutality of Vincent's actions. As the prosecutor recounted the evidence, the life insurance policies, the cigarette butt, the call records, and the car rental that didn't match Vincent's alibi, the courtroom fell into an eerie silence. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. It painted a picture of a man who had meticulously planned the murders of his family to escape the life he had grown to resent. The defense tried to paint Vincent as a man under extreme stress, a man pushed to the edge by the pressures of his family life, the overwhelming responsibilities of being a father and husband. They argued that Vincent had not acted with malice, but out of a deep-seated frustration. But no one in the room believed it. The evidence spoke louder than any excuse, and the jury's eyes rarely left Vincent, knowing full well the gravity of the situation. As the trial progressed, Joni's family sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief. Ernestine's absence was felt by everyone who knew her. The children, Mark and Lindsay, were gone, their lives taken before they even had a chance to experience what the world had to offer. It was impossible for anyone in the courtroom not to feel the weight of that loss. When it came time for Vincent to speak in his defense, his words were carefully chosen, rehearsed. He denied everything, of course, denied planning the murders, denied wanting to kill his family. He claimed he had no memory of the night in question, that he had been overwhelmed by stress and unable to think clearly, but his words rang hollow, failing to convince anyone. Detective Monroe watched from his seat as Vincent attempted to downplay the calculated nature of his actions, but it was obvious to everyone that he had planned the murders for months. He had premeditated it, thought it through in detail, and executed it with chilling precision. The only thing Vincent hadn't counted on was the diligence of law enforcement and the sharp instincts of Detective Monroe, who had relentlessly pursued the truth. As the trial neared its conclusion, the defense rested, and the jury was left to deliberate. It was clear, however, that there was little doubt in their minds. The case was a slam dunk. The evidence, the lies, and the truth had all been laid bare. When the jury returned, their verdict was swift, guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted into murmurs of shock and relief, though the relief was not for Vincent. It was for the victims, the family that had been torn apart by a man who had once promised to protect them. Monroe stood up, his heart heavy with the knowledge that justice had been served, but it was a bittersweet victory. The lives lost could never be brought back. But at least now, there was accountability. Vincent's life would never be the same. As the bailiff called for order in the court, Vincent Brothers was escorted out, his expression still unreadable, his face still locked in that cold mask. But inside, the man who had once thought he could escape it all now faced the undeniable truth. He had been caught, and he would pay the price for the lives he had stolen. The courtroom was still, the tension thick in the air as the judge called the room to order. Vincent Brothers, the man who had meticulously planned and executed the brutal murders of his wife, children, and mother-in-law, sat in the defendant's chair, hands clasped tightly in front of him. His face was an unreadable mask, but anyone looking closely could see the subtle tremor in his jaw. The weight of the trial, the endless days of scrutiny, had worn him down. But there was something else, a flicker of anxiety, a realization that his fate was about to be sealed. The prosecution had presented a strong case, laying out every detail of the crime with precision. The defense had tried to argue that Vincent's actions were the result of extreme stress, but the evidence had been damning. His cold, calculated behavior spoke louder than any emotional defense. The jury had deliberated for hours, and now, as the judge prepared to read the verdict, the room was filled with a sense of finality. Detective Monroe sat in the back of the room, his eyes fixed on Vincent. He had seen the darkness in this man, the emptiness that led to the destruction of an entire family. The case had taken its toll on him, as it did with every investigation he was involved in, but this one had felt personal. The victims, Joni, Ernestine, Marks, Marshall, and Lindsay, had been innocent. The pain they had suffered was unimaginable, Monroe knew the justice system could never bring them back, but he had hoped that it would at least bring closure to those who had loved them. The courtroom fell silent as the judge raised his hand, signaling that the jury had reached a verdict. All eyes turned toward the front of the room. Vincent remained still, his gaze focused straight ahead, his lips pressed together in a thin line, the only sign of tension. The prosecutor stood, his voice steady as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a verdict," the prosecutor said, his tone firm and unwavering. The judge nodded, his voice echoing through the room as he asked, "Will the defendant please rise?" Vincent stood slowly, his movements stiff and deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge began reading the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant Vincent Brothers guilty of all charges of first-degree murder, with special circumstances including the murders of multiple victims." A heavy silence followed. The words echoed in Vincent's ears, but he didn't react. His expression remained unchanged, though a subtle shift in his eyes hinted at the realization that his life, as he knew it, was over. He had been found guilty, but it hadn't been a surprise. Deep down, he had known that this moment would come. He had been too careful, too methodical to think he could escape justice forever. The judge continued, reading the sentencing recommendations. The room seemed to close in around Vincent. His future was no longer his own. His eyes briefly flickered to the victims' families sitting in the front row. They were the ones who had suffered the most. And yet, as he stood there, he felt nothing. No remorse, no relief, just emptiness. As the judge banged the gavel, declaring the sentencing hearing concluded, Monroe couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. The truth had come to light. It hadn't been easy, but justice had prevailed. The families of the victims rose from their seats, their faces somber but resolute. They had endured so much, but today they were one step closer to finding peace. The pain of losing their loved ones would never fully disappear, but at least now there was accountability. Vincent was escorted out of the courtroom, his face still blank, his future uncertain. As he passed by, Monroe's eyes met his for a brief moment. There was no hint of emotion in Vincent's expression, no acknowledgement, no apology, just a hollow, empty gaze. It was as though he had never truly understood the weight of his actions, the lives he had destroyed in his pursuit of freedom. For Monroe, the case was over. But for the families of the victims, the verdict was only a small part of the journey. Justice had been served, but healing would take time. The courtroom doors closed behind Vincent as he was led away, and the silence that followed was deafening. The truth had been exposed, and the lives that had been taken could never be brought back. But at least for once, there was justice. The trial was over, and the courtroom had emptied. The families of Joni, Ernestine, Marquet, Marshall, and Lindsay were left to grapple with the loss of their loved ones. The finality of the justice system's verdict settling into the painful reality that no matter what, their family would never be whole again. Detective Monroe sat alone in his office, the familiar hum of the city outside his window, doing little to drown out the heaviness in his heart. It had been weeks since the verdict was delivered, and the relief that had washed over him in the courtroom had long since faded. Justice had been served, but it hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't brought back the children, the wife, the mother-in-law. It hadn't eased the pain of the survivors. Monroe's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Detective Allen stepped in, a file in his hand. The two men had worked together for years, and yet, in the wake of this case, there was something different in the air, something unspoken. They both understood that this case had changed them. "You've been quiet," Allen said, his voice heavy. "How are you holding up?" Monroe leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't know," he muttered. "It's hard to feel like there's a win when you know that people are still suffering. Vincent's behind bars, but the damage is done. It's never going to bring them back." Allen nodded, sitting down across from him. "Yeah, but you did your job. We did our job. This wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about giving them some kind of peace, right?" Monroe remained silent for a moment. The words sounded hollow even to him. Peace seemed so distant, an impossible thing to achieve when the loss was so profound. There was no amount of closure that would fill the hole left in those families' lives. Meanwhile, Vincent's life had been completely upended. Behind bars, his stoic demeanor had crumbled. The man who had once believed he could escape it all was now facing the full weight of his actions. He had no one to blame but himself. The world outside had continued to move on, but inside his cell the silence was deafening. The reality of what he had done set in, slowly, painfully. But no apology, no admission of guilt could ever change the lives he had stolen. Months passed, and the media attention slowly died down. The families of the victims returned to their lives, though they would forever carry the scars. Joni's family had sought counseling, trying to rebuild the shattered pieces of their existence. But the memory of what had been lost still lingered in their minds. One day, Joni's sister sat down with Monroe. The grief had never fully left her eyes. She was tired, weary, but there was a resilience in her, a strength that had emerged from the tragedy. "I just wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for everything, for never giving up, for making sure Vincent didn't get away with it." Monroe's response was simple, but it held weight. "You don't need to thank me. This was about you all, about your family. I was just doing my job." But deep down, Monroe knew it was more than just that. There was a human element to the case that had touched him in ways he hadn't expected. The pain, the heartbreak, the anger, it had all collided in this one tragic event, and even now, after everything had been said and done, there was still a hole in his chest. For the families, life would never return to normal. They would learn to carry on, but the absence would always be there. As for Vincent, his fate was sealed. But it wasn't just about the years he'd spent in prison. It was about the lives he had destroyed, the love he had shattered. He had chosen his path, and now he would have to live with the consequences. As Monroe stared out of his office window that evening, he couldn't help but reflect on how fragile life was. The justice system had done its part, but it couldn't bring back what had been lost. He could only hope that in time, the families would find a way to heal, even if they would never fully recover. The case was closed, but the echoes of the past would linger forever. What do you think of Vincent Brothers and his shocking actions? Do you believe justice was truly served in this case? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case intriguing and want to hear more true crime stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode.